Evolutionary Theory, Section 2. In this section we're going to apply Darwin's ideas. We'll start with a bell ringer, talk about the key ideas for this section. We'll look at evolution by natural selection, what Darwin explained, and we'll evaluate his ideas. So your bell ringer. How do you think studying fossils can tell you about how an organism lived? Is it A, fossil evidence tells us where and how an organism lived? B, fossil evidence shows us the name of a species? C, fossils help to create new organisms out of existing species? D, fossils show us what the soft tissue of organisms looked like along with the color of the organism? Or E, fossils are often fake due to the fact that American museums pay millions of dollars for missing links. So our key ideas in this section. What does Darwin's theory predict? Why are Darwin's ideas now widely accepted? What are the strengths and weaknesses of Darwin's ideas? So evolutionary theory by means of natural selection. During Darwin's day, there was a lot of study going into populations. Darwin found that every living thing has the potential to produce many offspring, but not all of the offspring tend to survive. And so he formed a key idea. He thought that individuals have traits that better suit their environment. Those organisms are more likely to survive and pass their genetic information on to the next offspring or the next generation. So individuals that have certain traits tend to produce more offspring than others do. The differences that he saw were parts of natural selection. He proposed that natural selection is the cause of evolution. When we're talking about this context, we're talking about evolution as being the change in the inherited characteristics of a population from one generation to the next. Participation question. Darwin thought that every organism had the potential to do what? Was it A, produce very few offspring? B, produce offspring that were fit to their environment? C, survive in any environment? D, produce many offspring, even though not all would survive? Or E, survive catastrophic events? With this in mind, who do you think has the greatest probability of passing traits on to the next generation? A or B? And then the next question is, are those traits going to allow for the next generation to reproduce more successfully? So there's a number of steps in Darwin's theory. The explanation of his theory is often called the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. His theory predicts that over time, the number of individuals that carry advantageous traits will increase in a population. So that is, if you have a trait that better allows you to survive, you are more likely to survive. And then you will pass your genes on to the next generation, and those genes are going to be the advantageous traits that allow them to survive. Recall that when we talked about genetics, organisms pass on certain traits from parents to offspring. This is the study of heredity. There are 4 steps in Darwin's theory. The first one is overproduction, then variation, then selection, and finally adaptation. So overproduction is where Darwin thought that every population is capable of producing more offspring than can survive in that environment. So the environment ends up choosing the fittest. or choosing the individual that has characteristics that better allow it to survive in the environment. Those that are weak tend to die out, and therefore they do not pass their genes on to the next generation. Darwin also thought, for step 2, that variation occurred. Variation exists within every population. Our variation is due to inherited traits. So everyone is slightly different. Nobody is exactly the same. Step 3 is selection. So in a given environment, having a particular trait can make individuals more or less likely to survive and have successful offspring. So some individuals leave more offspring than others do. And the advantageous traits that those offspring have may allow them to survive better within an environment. You can see in the picture here a number of different camouflaging patterns for giraffes. And you will notice that there are different populations in different parts of Africa where those traits or those characteristics are expressed. Step 4 is adaptation. So over time, the traits that improve survival and reproduction will become more common. So what is the proper sequence for the steps in Darwin's theory of evolution? Is it A, adaptation, selection, variation, and overproduction? Is it B, variation, overproduction, adaptation, and selection? Is it C, overproduction, variation, selection, and adaptation? Or is it D, selection, adaptation, overproduction, and variation? And here is the answer to that. Overproduction occurs within every species, in every population of a species. Variation then plays in. So the individuals of the population have many different characteristics. Selection then occurs. It may be an environmental impact. So some individuals survive longer and they reproduce more than others do. So you see in this population where the long-furred or long-coat organisms and the moderate coat organisms tended to survive. Maybe it was a situation where the winter was exceptionally harsh. And so the ones that were better suited to the environment survived. And because they were better suited to the environment, they were able to pass their genes on to the next generation. That's adaptation. The traits of those individuals that survive and reproduce will become more common in the population.
Natural selection is the process by which populations of organisms change in response to their environment. As an example, consider recent studies by Peter and Rosemary Grant of finches that live on the Galapagos Islands. These birds vary in body size and the shape and size of their beaks. Ground finches constantly compete for food. They eat different types of seeds which they crack open with their beaks. In 1977, severe drought greatly reduced island vegetation, making all types of seeds scarce, including the small, soft seeds that are the finch's favorite food. Soon, only larger, tougher seeds remained. The natural conditions favored finches with larger, stronger beaks that were able to eat the larger seeds and therefore survive to reproduce. Many smaller beaked finches perished. The offspring of the surviving finches that year were larger birds with larger beaks. So the environmental pressures, drought in this case, led to a population of finches with larger beaks. Natural selection can go in the other direction as well. In 1985, heavy rains led to more small, soft seeds, which small-beaked finches are best able to eat. The following generation had more small-beaked finches.
So which is the key part of natural selection? Is it A, inherited variation, B, environmental variation, C, homologous structures, or D, low reproductive rates? Darwin's theory explains why living things vary in form yet seem to match their environment. Each habitat presents some unique challenges and opportunities for survival and reproduction. Each organism may be better suited to the environment, and if it's better suited to the environment, the population ends up gaining traits that allow it to survive better within that population or within that environment. So each species evolves because the selection of those individuals that survive, the many challenges that occur, or make best opportunities of the environment. So each species becomes adapted to its environment as a result of living in it over a long period of time. And adaptation is an inherited trait that is present in a population because the trait helps individuals survive and reproduce in a given environment. Darwin's theory explains evolution as a gradual process of adaptation. So the cartoon here says, so we beat the crowd, now what? And the penguin is saying, adapt, baby, adapt. So according to Darwin, all organisms seem to do what with regard to their environment? Do they A, disregard it, B, match it, C, destroy it, D, compete with it, or E, create it? Also, it's important for us to realize that Darwin's theory refers to populations and species, not individuals. So as we are talking about this theory of evolution, we're talking about how a population changes over time, not how an individual may change. Also keep in mind that a species is a group of populations that can interbreed. So which of the following evolves? Is it A, individuals in a species, B, the population of a given species, C, the appendages of a given organism, or D, the DNA of an individual organism?
These finches have all descended from a common ancestor. They look different because they have adapted to different environments and food sources. The large ground finch has a heavy, strong beak adapted for cracking big, hard seeds. The cactus finch has a tough beak that acts like a pair of needle-nosed pliers. It is adapted for eating cactus and its nectar. The warbler finch's small pointed beak works like a pair of tweezers. It is adapted for probing into cracks and crevices to obtain insects for food. The different beak sizes of these finches are traits that make each finch better able to survive in its environment. Thus, the beak size of each finch is an adaptive advantage.
Darwin eventually publicized his theory. In 1844, he finally wrote an outline for his ideas. And at that time, he only showed it to a few scientists. He was afraid that his ideas would be controversial. In 1858, he received a letter from another scientist and naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace. So in what year did Darwin finally write an outline on his ideas? Was it A, 1994, B, 1902, C, 1892, D, 1844, or E, 1830? Wallace asked for Darwin's opinion on a new theory that he had been developing. And the theory was much like Darwin's. Because of the similarity, both Darwin and Wallace, they both presented their ideas to groups of scientists. And so Darwin was finally motivated to publish his full book. So who helped to motivate Darwin to publish a full book of his ideas? Was it A. Wallace, B. Lyell, C. Lamarck, D. Malthus, or E. Cuvier? Darwin's book is called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, and it presented evidence that there was some form of change over time that occurred within populations. He used a large amount of data, and he supported his data with examples. And so biologists began to accept that evolution occurs and that natural selection helps explain it. So what he explained. His book was a thorough presentation of the evidence that living species changed over time from organisms that lived in the past. He presented a unifying explanation for data from multiple fields of science. The science fields that he collected data from included geology, geography, ecology, developmental biology, anatomy, genetics, and biochemistry. So which area of science was not used by Darwin as evidence for his theory of evolution? Was it A. ecology, B. geology, C. genetics, D. biochemistry, or E. ichthyology? So Darwin used a number of different supports or proofs to explain his theory. The first one is the fossil record. So he looked at large numbers of fossils, and he looked at organisms that lived in the past. All of those fossils that scientists have collected and found make up what we know as the fossil record. So scientists compare the fossil record from old organisms to more recent organisms and then to current organisms. And there seems to be a pattern of gradual change. Darwin noticed that the patterns occurred, but he was unaware of the many gaps in the patterns. And he predicted, based on the fact that there were not very many, or there were very many holes in that fossil record, he predicted that there would be intermediate forms eventually found over time. It's also important to realize that conditions that are needed to create fossils are extremely rare. So we'll never have a complete fossil record of all the species that lived on Earth in the past. So the fossil record may grow, but it will never be complete. The fossil record, will it A, grow, but never be complete? B, it provides evidence of evolution. C, is a record of Earth's past life forms. Or D, all the above. Biogeography. Biogeography is the study of the locations of organisms around the world. And this was also used as one of the proofs for Darwin's theory of evolution. So when traveling, Darwin and Wallace saw evolution at work, especially when they compared organisms and environments. There were times where geography separated populations, according to both theories. So for example, a group of organisms may have become separated into two groups living on different islands. Over time, the two groups would change based on what was in the environment in order for them to survive. Geologists and biologists have found that the movement of landforms in Earth's past help to explain patterns in the types and locations of both fossils and living organisms. Sometimes this separates individuals of the same species. Is it A, a natural barrier, B, a catastrophe, C, a predator, D, prey, or E, 8th grade students wanting to have a pet?
Geographic isolation is the physical separation of populations of organisms. Populations may become separated by a newly formed canyon, a mountain range, or a body of water. Any barrier that keeps members of one population from coming into contact with another population isolates those populations. This population of rabbits has an equal number of members with gray fur and with brown fur. When a river dramatically and permanently changes course, however, a small population of gray rabbits is stranded on a newly formed island. Somehow they manage to survive, but over many generations the descendants of these island rabbits begin to exhibit unique characteristics, such as an increased ability to tolerate drought and slightly larger ears to help them stay cool. Given enough time, the two populations of rabbits may become so different that they can no longer interbreed. If this occurs, they are then considered to be two separate species.
So what is the process called where individuals from a population become separated from other individuals of the same species? Is that A, isolation, B, removal, C, reproductive isolation, D, adaptation, or E, evolution? Developmental biology was also used to support Darwin's idea of evolution. The ancestry of organisms is also evident in the ways that multicellular organisms develop from embryos. The study of such development is called embryology. The study is very interesting because embryos undergo many physical and genetic changes as they develop into mature forms of life. Scientists may compare the embryonic development of species to look for similar patterns and for similar structures. Those similarities most likely derived from an ancestor that the species have in common according to this theory. One example of this is that embryologists say that during the development of all vertebrate embryos, there is some form of tail that occurs, and then as those individuals develop, especially in primates, the tail eventually disappears. Remember, vertebrates are animals that have backbones.
Look at these three embryos. They all have things in common. Notice the eye bud, the tail, and the arm buds. Like the gorilla, humans have a tail bud that disappears over time. Notice that the gorilla has no tail as an adult, but has a tail bud as an embryo. Even the fish and the mammals share similarities. The fish has gills that take oxygen from the water. Humans and gorillas have gill pouches as early embryos. The human aorta is a remnant of the gill pouch.
So the study of how organisms develop as embryos is A, embryology, B, developmental organization, C, in developmental biology, or D, molecular development. Anatomy. Anatomy is another proof for Darwin's theory of evolution, or what was used as a proof for his theory of evolution. Anatomy is body structure. And so we compare the differences, or the different species of organisms, and we look at their body structure and look for similarities. Scientists see that there are many similarities between different species of organisms. The hypothesis that all vertebrates descended from a common ancestor is supported based on this anatomical structure identification.
Vestigial features are structures that may not have a use. They are remnants of once used structures. The whale is a mammal and gives milk to its young just like humans do. Although modern whales do not have hind limbs, there are remnants of hind limb bones inside their bodies. A whale has a pelvis-like structure. This supports the idea that the whale is a creature that left the sea, then lived on land. Over time, it went back to the sea where it no longer needed its hind limbs for locomotion.
So observations of the anatomy of both fossil organisms and living vertebrates helps to support this hypothesis. When we compare modern vertebrates, the differences in size, number, and shape of their bones is clear, yet there seems to be a basic pattern in those bone structures. So for example, the forelimbs of many vertebrates are composed of the same basic groups of bones. The pattern is used to support Darwin's theory of evolutionary change. The bones are an example of what are called homologous structures. And these are characteristics that are similar in two or more species and that have been inherited from a common ancestor of those species. So we have similarities in the structure of those bones.
The forelimbs of all vertebrates are made from the same basic groups of bones. We say that such structures are homologous. The human arm has 6 groups of bones. The humerus is the bone in the top part of your arm extending from your shoulder to your elbow. The radius and ulna allow you to rotate your hand to turn your palm facing up and down. The bones in your fingers are called the phalanges. When we compare the human arm to the forelimb of a penguin, an alligator, and a bat, we find some striking similarities. In all cases, the humerus extends from the body of the animal to a point where the forelimb can bend. Next in line come the radius and ulna, in each case side by side. The end of the forelimb, however, shows more dramatic adaptations. In a bat, the phalanges become the tips of the wing. And in a penguin, some of the bones have become fused. Even in these cases, however, similarities in bone structure lead us to define these features as homologous.
So structures that are no longer used by an organism, which is used as a type of evidence for organisms evolving, is that A, homologous structures, B, vestigial structures or organs, C, anatomical divergence, D, gradualism, or E, punctuated equilibrium. Biochemistry is also used to support Darwin's theory. So to explain the patterns of change seen in anatomy, scientists make testable predictions. For example, if species have changed over time, the genes that determine their characteristics should have also changed. Genes can change by mutation, and that such change can make new variations appear. Natural selection may select against some varieties and favor others. So a comparison of DNA or amino acid sequences shows that some species are more generally similar than others. Those comparisons, like those in anatomy, are evidence of hereditary relationships among species.
The mature red blood cell is little more than a membrane sac containing hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a string of amino acids. This hypothetical string of amino acids will be used to show the difference between gorilla and human hemoglobin. Human hemoglobin and gorilla hemoglobin differ by only one amino acid. In this hypothetical amino acid chain, notice that the amino acid that is purple in the gorilla chain is orange in the human chain. The similarity between gorilla and human hemoglobin strongly suggests that gorillas and humans share a recent common ancestor. Thus, the more similar the homologous proteins are in different species, the more closely related the species are thought to be. Do you see that the gorilla and human fetuses appear very similar?
Evaluating Darwin's ideas. Darwin's work had three major strengths: evidence of evolution, a mechanism for evolution, and the recognition that variation is important. Today, Darwin is given credit for starting a revolution in the area of biology. So we'll start by looking at the strengths of this theory. Darwin was not the first to come up with his ideas. He was the first one to use a large amount of data and use that data as evidence to support his theory. His book was a very long argument that evolution is possible. So one strength of Darwin's work is that it's supported by and helps explain a very large amount of data. He presented a logical and testable mechanism that it could account for the processes of evolution. His theory of natural selection was well thought out and convincing to scientists of his time as well as today. Finally, Darwin changed the way scientists thought about the diversity of life. Before Darwin arose, most scientists saw species as stable, unchanging things. They classified species based on average appearances and ignored variation. But Darwin showed that variation was everywhere, and it could help to serve as the starting point for evolution. Let's now look at the weaknesses in his theory. Darwin's explanations were incomplete in one major way. He knew very little about genetics. Evolution can't be repeated in an experiment and has not been observed in nature. There is no mechanism to explain the theory of evolution even today. So what would be the driving force for this theory of evolution? We can't explain that. Inherited variation was crucial to Darwin's theory of natural selection, yet his theory lacked a clear mechanism for inheritance, which later was somewhat solved by the study of genetics. At different times, Darwin proposed or accepted several ideas for such a mechanism, but none of them were correct. So Gregor Mendel began to solve that problem. But Gregor Mendel's findings about heredity were not published until 1900. Today, an understanding of genetics is essential to understanding this idea of evolution. Even with an understanding of genetics, many of the proofs that we just talked about for evolution have been disproven, and yet they are still used as evidence for the theory. So in summary, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection predicts that over time, the number of individuals that carry advantageous traits will increase in a population. Darwin presented a unifying explanation for data from multiple fields of science. The strengths of Darwin's work include evidence of evolution, a mechanism for evolution, and the recognition that variation is important. Placed Darwin's ideas among the most important of our time. However, Darwin lacked a mechanism for inheritance.